Backyard Green Films is proud to present this episode of Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Alara and her husband Rick travel throughout the land in their teardrop trailer that they have nicknamed Maggie, bringing you stories about their travels and the people they meet. They visit farmers, ranchers, and just about anyone who loves putting their hands in the dirt or their feet in stirrups. For the past 3 years, they have been filming a documentary about heritage breed animals entitled The Holstein Dilemma, Heritage Breeds, and the Need for Biodiversity. In those travels, they have gotten to meet some very interesting people. Here's one of those interviews.
It's alive! Okay, so ever since we met with the Shockies, that movie quote's been going through my head. Our food is alive. Or it can be. Or it should be. Often one of those things. And it's not just food as we usually think about it. You're eating a vegetable like a carrot. You're eating an animal like a cow. You're eating a combination of two organisms like a pickle. Wait, what was that last one? That can't be right. You misspoke, Alara. Ha! No, I did not. All you vegans listening out there, I give you fair warning that proceeding much further in this particular podcast might cause you to shift your thinking, or also maybe starve to death depending on your reaction to it. Just a warning. So I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. The introduction. We sat down with Christopher and Kirsten Shockey on a very warm summer day in August at their farm in southern Oregon. You won't be able to smell the smoke from the wildfire on the other side of the hill, or feel the heat shimmer off the front driveway, or watch the rare species of turtles sunning on the specially made raft in the back pond, or pet that very sweet dog that came to check us out in the driveway. Hopefully, the rest of the sounds will help you feel like you were there with us at the picnic table in their backyard. The sounds of the ice clinking in the glasses, or the neighbor's turkeys cackling in the distance, or the grandchild that wandered in to see what we were doing. Let me start by saying that I usually do a bit of research before we go to do an interview, but when I started to dive into this topic, it became a rabbit hole of information and areas that I had no idea were related. Let me read you a few definitions. From Merriam-Webster and Wikipedia, I give you my newest word, zymology, a science that deals with fermentation, or an applied science which studies the biochemical process of fermentation and its practical uses. Common topics include the selection of fermenting yeast and bacteria species and their use in brewing, winemaking, fermenting milk, and the making of other fermented foods. The online dictionaries also had a definition that was a little more mentally descriptive of the fermentation process. 1. The chemical breakdown of a substance by bacteria, yeasts, or other microorganisms, typically involving effervescence and the giving off of heat. 2. The process of fermentation involved in the making of beer, wine, and liquor, in which sugars are converted to ethyl alcohol. 3. Agitation or excitement. It's the archaic version. I think this one's rather apt for the topic too after watching the erupting strawberry tower on the Shocky's website. This week's podcast is one that, believe it or not, fits beautifully into the concept of biodiversity, and it fits in more ways than you might think. Diversity in general could have to do with species, or ecosystems, or cultures, or demographic mixes within an area. Whether it's applied to cultures, foods, or microbes, biodiversity is a common thread here. If you want to have an adventurous hour or 2 or 12, look up the list of fermented foods on Wikipedia and see the list that pops up. Nearly every country or culture does it, and it's been around for about 7,000 years now that we know of. There are some truly delightful and truly different types of products that fall into the fermented category. Everyone can come up with a few. Yogurt, beer, vinegar, wine, sauerkraut, kombucha, pickles, and things like that. But I have to say that I didn't immediately think of some of the other items on the list, so I'll name a few in case anyone else is in my category of ignorance. Soy sauce, sour cream, buttermilk, cheese, bread, miso, salami, Tabasco and Worcestershire sauce, and cocoa. Yes, chocolate is a fermented item. Look it up if you don't believe me. Here's where the vegans might have a moment or two of angst, I would think. So now we come to the case of the dead pickle. I'm not sure that's completely accurate in the context of the conversation you're about to hear, but I'm having a hard time getting that reference out of my head now after talking to the Shockies. Some of our favorite foods are truly dead. Some of them are vibrantly alive. Some of them that should be vibrantly alive are deader than they need to be, and it's not necessarily good for us. I'm a person that always got completely grossed out at the thought of eating in a sushi bar where they kill the hapless animal right in front of you and it's still thrashing on the plate. But maybe we're not far from that if you look at the reality of what we eat on a daily basis. Many of our favorite foods are alive when we're eating them, if we can see them thrash or not. The kinds of bacteria that the Shockies teach people how to propagate for consumption are really good for us, and often are more than happy to be consumed, or so the science is now discovering. It's kind of like the mothership heading to a distant planet to colonize open spaces. Apparently, the human microbiome and our gut flora are a whole new world, with new colonists landing all the time. And apparently, it's the planet the little critters will rule, in many cases, whether the locals, us, are aware of it or not. Benevolent rulers, that's what we think they are. Well, that's if we actually are doing the thinking, not them, though the current science says otherwise about who's actually in charge. The human biome is more than the bacteria in your gut. It's more than microbes. According to thescientist.com, the adult human body's microbial system can be anywhere from 2 to 6 pounds of your body weight. Most of them live in your gut, but they're everywhere, and we need them. Does anyone else have the urge to scrub in a very hot shower all of a sudden? Damn it, I'm confused already. I'm gonna go eat another yogurt or pickle so I can think better about this. Or the little critters I ingest can tell me to be happy and not worry. Apparently they do that too. With no further ado, here are the wonderfully adventurous authors, speakers, chemists, cooks, inventors, explorers, and fermentistas, Christopher and Kirsten Shockey. Okay, if you would state your names and your titles or your jobs or whatever you consider yourself to be.
Oh, you go first.
I'm Kirsten Shockey, and I guess I'm an author and a fermentation experimenter, educator. I don't know.
Heavy on the experimenter for sure.
Definitely educator.
Christopher Shockey, also a freelance writer and author of four books now with Kirsten, and also I also teach fermentation arts and a little bit about neuroscience.
How long have you both been considering yourself as the, I don't know, fermentista and the author? Has this been something you've done for your whole lives?
Oh no.
Oh no.
So so I'd say the first part of ours, I had a career with Hewlett-Packard, so I worked in technology. And we moved here in 1998 because I had teams around the world, so we could live where we wanted to, really. We looked for played-out farms all across the country, trying to figure out what we could afford, and we fell in love with this place. And so we moved here in 1998.
We had 3, and I was pregnant at the time, but we wanted a place where the kids could grow up and be connected to not just the land, but know where their food came from. Yeah. So there's a lot of years of homesteading behind us.
In this place, the family had moved here in the 40s and raised 4 kids. There used to be an old house on the property, and the son built the parents this house that we're in now. And so they had it on the market for 12 years, I think, or 14 years. If you were from California, they would say no. If you said, oh, that would be a lovely spot up there for a house, they would say no.
It was a for sale by owner.
Yeah.
They could make these decisions.
If you looked at the trees and said, those look valuable, they would say no. And so we got here and it was one of those 105-degree days, and so the kids stripped off and played in the creek, and I walked the property, and so I think we reminded them of their family, and so that's why they let us buy it. But we've met people, I don't know, for the decades since that said, oh, that Gibson property, we tried to buy that.
So it's like the dog, either you like you or they don't.
Exactly, they like you know. So, and we did that, and then in 2006, I left HP and didn't know what I wanted to do. Worked at a music festival over the summer, and I kind of considered myself retired, except for we had no money. So Kirsten said, you know, you're going to have to work. So part of that,
Details.
yeah, part of that was, yeah, we launched a food company, organic food company, and built the certified kitchen onto the house, and made a go of that for a while.
So it seems like that came out of left field. Launched a food company. Did you have experience in that prior?
Well, all those years that we were here, so we moved here in '98, and up until that point, our dream was to work together, you know, do something that, it was a little house on the prairie dream, really. You know, just a small family business where the kids would learn about business, and, you know, we'd get to work together and all of that. And so I was a cheesemaker. Christopher made cider for friends and family and, you know, us, but cheese making didn't quite seem to be there's just so many laws around raw milk, and the type of cheese that we wanted to make was not the type that, you know, would be wanted out, or the laws really were constraining. Plus, this property is wonderful, but we wouldn't be able to sustain the amount of animals here, you know, in a sustainable, good for the ground and the creek and all that way. You'd need so many more inputs coming in to have that many animals. Plus our milkers were growing up. And so cheese business, I was making the cheese, but at least I wasn't milking the animals.
We were so much slower than
We were so much slower. And they were about to leave, so they were getting big. And anyway, so it was vegetables. We'd been fermenting vegetables as part of the garden thing, and it seemed to be, you know, I said to Christopher, nobody's ever died from a fermented vegetables. It's really safe. Nobody can sue us and take our farm. And so we started, the first year we were just kind of, what do they call that? Processing for other people, vegetables from their farms, you know, overages, seconds, vegetables that otherwise would go into the compost pile or whatever could be still value added. And so we did that for a year, and after that we decided to have our own label. But yeah, it wasn't out of the blue. We kept trying to figure out how can we make a little bit of a living with, you know, land that isn't made for farming and all of that. So that's kind of where that came up.
Well, actually, tell me a little bit about this. People won't know this, but there's smoke on the horizon here, and it's 100 degrees periodically here, I would assume. It's 90 right now, I think, or 85 or something.
It's in the 80s
in
today.
this
It's a
area?
nice day, yeah.
Yeah, it's
But
beautiful
usually
out right now.
Yeah, it's usually pretty hot in the summer.
Yeah.
It's an interesting area because we are on the edge of, you know, kind of that Mediterranean climate. We get really, really hot, dry summers and really wet winters. I always think the forest must be a little bit bipolar to handle it. But, you know, and when we first got here, it was really pleasant. And now it's getting harder and harder because those extremes are like everywhere, becoming more extreme. And so the summers are drier and hotter. And we used to hardly ever see smoke, and now it's like we have 5 seasons, and the smoke season is kind of what happens to summer. And today is smoky but lovely compared to
So it's variations
What
of
it's been.
smoke now.
Yes.
It's like, this is pretty clear.
it's like,
which
oh,
means
it smells like a campfire, but I don't feel like I'm
we're not wearing
choking.
masks.
We're not wearing masks.
Yeah. Sometimes you can see the sun directly with your naked eye. That's a bad day, right? That's Shanghai.
Right.
So yeah, so that's just part of what this has become. And so it's hard. We still travel the world and always come back and love that we live here. So we've kind of doubled down to stay.
But last summer when we were 2 months into daily smoke, we really were wondering.
Right. But I mean, every place is struggling with climate change in a different way, you know, and so I don't think there's a place you can go, you know, that's like, oh, now this place is very livable. So you really have to just decide what you're going to do, stay in place and figure out what you're going to do about it, I think. And so we had our kids back. We have 4 kids, and the third one graduated from college, and so they all came back, and we had these family meetings, which is fun because they raided the cider cave, and so I lost a lot of cider during these family meetings. But we talked about, you know, if this is, because those are the generations that are going to keep going, and so we're really looking at it as like, you know, multiple generations. What do we do now on our watch, because we lost Kirsten's mom a few years ago, and so now we're the old,
You're the next in line.
we're the next in line, which is uncomfortable. And so we want to figure out, and we didn't have those conversations really with her, you know, to know that, and so we feel like, okay, we have to do this. So we've been talking to the kids, and you know, the grandkids are 5 and 2, so they're not quite ready to have those kind of conversations. But, you know, what can we do? What can we learn from this place? How do we turn it into something that has focus and that is something they're interested in keeping going? Because we feel like there's so many aspects to the changing world, and if we can do work here that adds a little bit, we have the benefit. We have this place, so what can we do with it? You know, towards that. Fermentation is one of those things.
Okay, so I one thing I would like to ask you, you use the phrase fermentista. So if you think of yourself as a fermentista, where did you come up with that word? And are you a fermentisto or a
Is there gender?
the cider guy or the shredder, or how do you think of yourselves?
Well, it came from barista, and so we decided it's gender neutral.
Since we came up with it, we can say those things.
And yeah, it sort of came from when we used to be at market, and we didn't know, I mean, what are you? You're a baker if you make bread, you're a cheese maker, you're a cider maker, you're a sauerkraut maker, you're a pickle maker, you know, it was just, you're a fermenter, that's kind of a weird word. And because this food has been kind of a lost art, and you know, so we were just playing around with it, and he came back with coffee one day because he was, you know, talking to the barista.
We'd set up at the market at 7:30. We're hungry. We've been up since 5, and so the barista at this little hole-in-the-wall coffee place, we just struck up a conversation, and we were explaining all the different varieties. We take at least 9 varieties that day. So I was telling him different flavors and that was kind of thing. And then he was telling me about his coffee beans and where they were coming from. And then that's when he said, well, yeah, it's just, you're like a barista for vegetables. And I said, yeah, that'd be like a fermentista. And he's like, yeah, that'd be a and I came running back. He's like, here's your coffee. We're fermentistas. She's like,
I now know who I am.
so yeah, I guess we're that. I'm also a cider maker, but she says she's a cider maker now too. With the last book, she's been making cider, which warms my heart because now there's 2 cider makers in the family, which is, and now you're
a vinegar maker. I've already jumped.
Well, you know, it's interesting to me, the different areas in fermentation, and this is a whole new field to me, but I was looking up some of the different topics that come up, and we talk about fermenting, distilling, pickling, preserving, and in all of these categories, there's all kinds of things. I mean, they start listing things like, well, I have a list here. There's cheese, and there's miso. I mean, miso.
Yeah.
There's mead that's considered. So tell me about the differences in some of these things. Is it all pickling? Is it all fermenting? How are all those things related?
Well, I often have to start my classes with the difference between a pickle and a pickle. So pickling means to preserve something usually, but to acidify it. And so way back, I imagine people mostly did their pickling through fermentation, which is, or lactic acid fermentation. So you're creating the right environment, the microbes are moving in, they're eating your starches, so they're consuming the sugar and converting that to acid. So lactic acid fermentation is pickling, right? Because you're adding acid to something. Well, the microbes are adding acid. You're just setting up the environment. Vinegar is another way to add acid. You take your vegetable or whatever, you're adding the acid. And so that's also considered pickling. Well, with industrialization, most pickling became this quick thing, right? It's a lot quicker to make industrialized vinegar and throw that on your cucumbers, can it, off it goes, ready to market, then wait 2 or 3 weeks for the microbes to do that work for you. And so that's where people get confused, because pickling means to add acid to really anything. Like, you know, it can be pig's feet too. It doesn't have to be a cucumber. But cucumber in this time has become ubiquitous with pickle. And so that's where folks start the confusion. And so all of fermentation is pickling. Well, all of vegetable fermentation is pickling, but not all pickling is fermented, right? Does that make sense?
One is sort of neutered. No?
Well, one is sort of a tool in the pickling toolbox. So if this is the pickling toolbox, one way is fermentation, which is one way to get to that. But the other way is like vinegar, which...
Where would you put like yogurt, kefir, and still
I
in
mean,
that
you're
back to-
acidifying milk. And so in a way, cheese, in a way, is also pickled because you're acidifying it. But it's not considered a pickle. When it is considered a pickle is when it's feta, right? Because you're acidifying it and then you're dropping it in a brine. So it gets kind of crazy.
I mean,
But fermentation, really, if you want to get to the crux of that, pickles aside, is asking those microbes or providing the environment for those microbes to transform the food.
Okay.
And transformation is the big word here.
Okay, now the first thing that occurred to me when you started talking about the microbes, you're eating something that's living, correct? So the crazy thought that comes to me is, well, is it possible for a vegetarian to eat a pickle that's been fermented and still be a vegetarian? Because you're eating living things, right?
Vegetarians eat living things, I'm sorry to tell you.
And they'll get their vitamin B12 with it. So
but it's still
good for
living,
'em.
right? I mean,
Yeah.
it's like yogurt. Yogurt's still got things swimming around in there,
Absolutely.
correct?
Yeah.
They're really teeny, but
Yeah, that's the probiotics. That's the things everybody's chasing is probiotics, and a lot of those are beneficial bacteria. So
We need them.
a probiotic is just a living thing that's you're going to ingest. It's going to make it through your stomach, still alive, and make it into your small intestine or large intestine, and it's going to be there for some period of time. And prebiotics is the same. Prebiotics is the food that's going to feed those guys that are in your small intestine and your large intestine. So it is food that doesn't get broken down, still pass through the stomach.
It's also called resistant starch.
And then those guys, that's food for them, and we get energy by that bacteria in your gut processing the food, and it breaks it down into short chain fatty acids and other things that we absorb as to energy. So we have a lot of bacteria in us, more DNA bacteria than DNA human. So, I mean, if you really want to get funky and realize that we're hosts.
3 pounds is what I've heard. Is that correct? You
Yeah.
start with no outside bacteria, and your ecosystem. They have people that study this. They're ecosystem biologists, but human ecosystem. There's something like 3 pounds of bacteria. Is that correct? Outside
sure-
bacteria by the
sure.
time you get to adulthood.
We're really just a big tube if you think about it. It starts, there's a hole here and a hole there, and the skin and the inside, and that's where the bacteria mostly are on the skin of those tubes, on the inside of us and outside.
So
of
here's
us.
something to think about. I know you guys, do a lot with biodiversity, especially with farm animals. So humans have been losing their own ecology, their own biodiversity in their guts. So we're actually looking at guts of our generations now have way less diversity than they did, say, 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And part of that is things like, crappy diets and C-sections and all these assaults that if we're not eating fiber, we're not feeding our own microbes. And they turn around and say, what can we eat? Maybe start eating the linings of our intestines, or they die off, and then those mamas maybe have babies, so that baby is born with less bacteria to get started. And it actually is something just like many of the other species on the planet. Our bacteria are becoming less diverse.
Now that's a really interesting thing, because I mean, like, I'm a doctor's kid, so I understand that the intestinal flora is something that's just there, right? But I've never really thought of it as starving it. I mean, it makes sense to me if you have a pickle that's a fermented pickle and it has live and active things swimming around, you are introducing more. But if you have a dead pickle, was that incorrect? I mean, if you have a
I think
pickle
they
that,
probably wouldn't use that term.
I
But
know
yeah.
that sounds odd,
I'm with
doesn't
you,
it?
though. I'm with you.
You're not really introducing the same types of things. And if you put that across the board with preserved foods instead of foods that are active, sounds disgusting, but it's really true, then you really aren't feeding quite as much, are you?
No, it's really ferments and fiber are the two things that feed.
I was going to say, and actually, even though, like Christopher said, not all those live bacteria make it through the stomach acid, but I've been reading too that our bacteria will feed off of their little dead yeast bodies or whatever, and that is, I mean, we evolved with these foods is the thing. Throughout human history, microbes were the way to save our food, and we didn't have refrigeration, so there were microbes in our food. It wasn't until germ theory that we kind of went overboard, throwing the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, in getting rid of so much microbes in our food. And some of that's good. I mean, some of that food safety needs to happen, for sure. But now we're turning back and going, oh, wait a minute, we actually need foods with these qualities. We don't even fully understand why, but our bodies evolved with them, and people that consume them feel better. And so it's really interesting.
She talked about bacteria, but there are other microbes, yeast, for example. So same thing when in the vegetable ferments, that's bacteria. It's creating that sour, that acid, lactic acid, that makes the sour. But if you have bread, then that's yeast that's eating those sugars, but it's creating CO2 and alcohol. And when we bake our bread, the alcohol goes away. But when you get those big, nice holes in your bread, that's trapped CO2 that got trapped by the gluten mat. So that's how all those nice bubbles that we enjoy in our sourdough happen, are the yeast, and they're expiring, and so they're producing CO2. Beer is yeast again, but it's creating that alcohol, and that's what we want. So we're saving the alcohol, and the same thing with cider. So when you have fresh juice, there's a whole yeast flora that are on those apples and inside the apple, because that was the blossom initially, and those yeasts are just waiting to eat those sugars and create alcohol and CO2.
Okay, so now this is really, now I'm
And then there's the acetobacter.
There is acetobacter, lurking in the shadows to take a perfectly good cider and take it to the vinegar world, which is also good.
You're saying.
Not as fun.
No, I'm squirreling right now. My husband's a squirrel, and off I go with it. So there's about 50 things I want to ask, but the one thing that I look at, I see the books in front of you, and as you talk about yeast, I can see why you would do many different books, because it's like the difference between a horse and a cow. It's a whole different animal in a way.
And then these guys use both of those, so they're using, that makes sauerkraut seem pretty simple, because it's just bacteria that comes on it. Yeast, to make cider, you're using the bacteria on the fruit if you're doing wild or pitched yeast. But then with these fermented beans and grains, legumes and grains, you're using bacteria and yeast and fungus.
Huh.
Yes.
He points to me when he says fungus.
And fungus.
Mycelium will save the world someday, they say, so that's a compliment, right?
There you go.
It's also fairly complex.
Actually, the fungal ferments are pretty awesome. And I'll talk about them in a second, but I do want to backtrack to what he was saying with bread, which is, so in the industry, about 1850s, 60s, people started to figure out that they could kind of harvest and reproduce the same yeast over and over again, which kind of changed the baking industry, and to a bread that was getting closer and closer to what we think of as bread now that only has yeast in it. But the old sourdoughs and how bread has been made forever, those sourdoughs were this wonderful cooperation between bacteria and yeast. And that's breaking down the starches. And a lot of folks that can't tolerate gluten can tolerate real sourdough breads because there's both of these actions spending many, many hours instead of you pitch yeast and 2 hours later your bread's risen and baked, which is how the industrial yeasts work. But sourdoughs will take, a couple days even.
Start the day before.
And it's breaking down the gluten, it's breaking down those starches into ways that are way more consumable for the body. And so it's fun too how some of these work together. And when I talk about fungus, we'll talk about why the fungus makes the ferment happen.
Okay, well, you can't leave bread yet because I have another.
I could tell. That's why I shut up.
So I had a friend. We had a friend of our family way back when, and they had what they brought to us like the Holy Grail. It's like they were saving the Holy Grail and sharing it with us. And it was a sourdough starter, and it had been passed down. In perpetuity from I don't know which family member back in their history, but they said this is the best sourdough. You need to taste this, and you have to keep it alive. And they had it in the fridge, and it kept going. And sure enough, this is delicious sourdough. I mean, it was delicious, but it had a different taste to it. So it brings to mind that sourdough starter or any bread starter, if it's a combination of different factors in different areas, a different yeast, a different bacterium, it's just like a heritage breed animal or any breed of animal. It gets a different taste and a different character depending on who takes it where and what they add to it, no?
And the secret, is that it's going to be different in your house than it was in all those other houses.
Why?
Because when you take it out and you add more flour and more water, you're adding that flour that you're using and that water that you're using, introducing other things to it. And they're constantly, the thing about microbes is they're very competitive. They want to survive and they want to reproduce, just like us. It's the same thing. And in our guts, the same thing. There's a constant struggle, and it's either symbiosis or dysbiosis. When one team's way bigger, playing way bigger than the other guys. But they're always trying to find that commonality is everybody's trying to get along, or sometimes, right? It's the same thing in a sourdough too. So you've got multiple bacteria and yeast in there, and then when you're feeding it, you're not just feeding sterile media, you're feeding more bacteria and yeast, and so things, they come and go different ways.
They do, but if it's a really strong, like from here, maybe there was a really strong one, or like San Francisco's famous for that really. Those guys, even though they're constantly being assaulted with new bacteria and yeasts, they're pretty strong, so they're going to keep out that competition. But still, that sourdough will change where it's at.
Yeah. So does it evolve just like everything else on the planet evolves?
Oh, sure. And really fast. I mean, yeast don't live for 20, 30, 40 years. They do their thing, they eat, and they die. And so, the generations that you have and just within days, it's pretty fascinating. But I mean, it just carries on.
But they do go into a stasis of some kind because, there's
spores.
The little spores can just wait and wait and wait. Like they've found bottles of beer in shipwrecks from way, way back, and they're able to recreate those beers with the spores of those yeasts that are still alive in there, which is pretty awesome.
I think it's pretty awesome. Now it immediately comes to mind the Penn State guys that we talked to. They found sperm that was in a freezer, basically the cryopreservation from earlier than in the 1950s, and they put it into a modern Holstein, and it was a different cow. So I'm looking at this and thinking, I wonder if you could do the same thing with bread. If you found yeasts that were still alive at a previous time, if they would have a whole different taste than the things that we've morphed into now. Yeah. Because if it could stay alive, and you could, I don't know, does it stay alive in a cave for a long period of time if it's sealed up? Or once yeast doesn't get any outside anything, it's
No,
dead?
like in cider, there's studies in Ireland. So Saccharomyces cerevisiae, which is the kind of the common cider yeast, and also for beers too and bread. It's a really aggressive yeast, and 6 months, 9 months after they've completely cleaned the cider yeast, they can still find them. They're still alive. They're in the wood, scratched plastic, and that's why we do a lot of natural yeasts. So we don't introduce any new yeast to it. But those natural yeasts are kind of like teetotalers. They can drink at the party until about 5 or 6% alcohol, and then they're out. But we can make alcohols, ciders that are in the 9% alcohol. So what's up? Well, it's those other yeasts that are in all of our equipment. They're in our wood press, they're in our buckets. And so the wild yeast have their party, and the heavy drinkers are just waiting, and they're letting everybody just drink the light beers, and then here they come with the Jack. And then they party until they go out, which is 12, 15, 16%. So those guys they're in our equipment, they're in our house, just like that sourdough's likely you have some parts of your kitchen that have, yeast from that. They're constantly exchanging things, finding new places they can live. And we're just so unaware of that. And yet, when it makes something like bread, we're appreciative, or cider, or tempeh, or natto.
This is, I have fish tanks at home, and I don't know if people know about the nitrogen cycle. It's like magic. You just introduced one fish in water, and magically, out of the sky, out of the side of the tank, bacterium that will come and populate in the tank, and if you give it enough time, they'll start to take care of the chemicals that are bad in the tank, and then the tank cycles, ammonia, nitrates and nitrates, blah, blah, blah. So yeast is the same way. It exists everywhere, and you just have to introduce it into something different, and it will populate. Is that kind of how it goes?
Well, yeast do exist. I mean, a lot of microbes exist. Bacteria exists.
I mean, yeast is everywhere. I mean, with the cider making and now with the vinegar making. So for vinegar, you need ethanol. You need alcohol. So you need the yeast to create the ethanol. What yeasts want to eat are sugar. I mean, they're like us. They like sugar. They create the alcohol. And then, so what I've been doing is going up into the woods or on the farm or flowers or whatever, and just seeing what those wild yeasts will do and what they'll taste like. So I'll put them in a medium of sugar water or pasteurized apple juice or something where they've got some sugar, and you just drop the flowers in there or whatever, and or you can take some sugar water and leave it open under this tree or whatever, and then it'll start to bubble and start to ferment, and then you have those yeasts, and you can add them to other things like cider and see what they taste like as they start to. And some of them are really delicious. I mean, I took like 6 sunflower petals, just the petals alone, built it up, and it made that flavor carried through of sort of the nuttiness of a sunflower seed from 6 petals.
So the combinations are
Infinite.
Just infinite. If it's place, time, thing, and different thing, you could spend your entire life here combining things that, and you would never have uniformity of any kind, because it's always a different two pieces that come together.
Yeah.
It's like genes.
It's our bumblebee butts, right? I mean, they're the ones spreading all that around while they're pollinating. They're
I was
also
wondering how
spending-
you were going to come back to. I was for a second needed a frame of reference.
Which then points to the importance of pollinators and the importance of having ecosystems that support that, because those yeast need to be moved around, and so they need pollinators. And we've been in places around the world. We were in a field of flowers in Patagonia this year, and Kirsten said, she says, too quiet, and we looked around and we realized we didn't see any insects. And we're at the bottom of the world. We were within 100 miles of, a couple hundred miles of Antarctica, and that should have been protected from us. There's so few people there, and yet when we talked to people, they said, yeah, our pollinators, they just aren't coming back. And so for us to see that, or we saw it in Asia, we were talking to a gentleman that was our taxi guy, and he didn't have a concept of climate change, but he was telling us how it's getting hotter and hotter, and the trees are changing. He was describing climate change without the words that we would use, and he didn't understand what was going on. But they were planting trees because they just intuitively knew they need more shade because it's so hot.
So do you look at something like that and wonder how many microscopic yeasts and bacterium are going the way of all things that we'd never know?
Exactly, yeah.
Oh, for sure.
Because that's just at a different part of the food chain, And so
And all of our industrialization, it's done it to the animals, The Holstein is obviously productive, and so that's what we went with. The bread yeast is productive, that's what we went with. So with everything, so there's a I think a pretty big movement of folks out there. I mean, I guess maybe my mind big because like we're in the middle of meeting these people, but there's probably a tiny movement of folks out there who are fascinated by this and constantly trying, and they're not afraid to make a bad batch of cider or a bad batch of bread or whatever just to see what'll happen, because there's also that chance they're going to make something that is completely a flavor that just hasn't been tasted in a long time or ever, because they've hit this funny combination of things. And then there's folks that take it even further, and they isolate these yeasts. They find them on their grape plants or whatever, and then they start growing them in a petri dish and isolating them, and so that they can repeat it.
Because you could store them, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's interesting to me, as you talk about this, the self-interest part is always one that I really want, in many ways, like to focus on, because then people can relate to that particular thing. Oh, well, that's good for me. Maybe I should think about it a little bit more. Because that's kind of how humans are built. So if what you're talking about with the flora in the gut is important to us, if we're losing that, if it causes less general health, it is in our self-interest to make sure that our food is as varied as possible, if I'm interpreting that correctly, because it makes us healthier in general, and not just in a touchy-feely kind of way, but really kind of need that.
Yeah.
We need biodiversity in our gut. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. And it's funny, we used to talk. Now we meet people and we'll describe what we do, and they'll say, "Oh, you affect the gut microbiome." We think, "Okay, wow, we're already going to start there because it's in mainstream now. People are hearing about it and talking about it." Whereas before we had to kind of work in slowly. Well, here's how you eat. You're kind of a tube, and and now people have just jumped to that, and you can isolate and do kits and find out what's inside of you, and I think what we're going to see is soon. People want things that are really simple. The equivalent of the pill will be, well, I'll just get a new microbiome from someplace else, and start over. And I think we'll see that kind of thing, in our lifetimes for sure. Just swap it out with something new.
Okay, now one of the things obviously my list I haven't gotten very far on, but one of the things I wanted to talk to you about was, I told you I would do this, I'll try and be better.
Kind of fun.
But biodiversity and a diverse, our demographic is a diverse thing, but it's becoming in many ways homogenized because we have so many cultures that are mixing and matching.
Mm-hmm.
And I kind of wonder if we might have the pill, and it's a mix of something from China, something from the United States, if we need that diversity, is that going to be something that we lose after a while because we're all putting too many things in the pot at one time? I can go down here and get Chinese food. I can get, Indian food. I can get all the rest of these things that may have different flavors. Is that the same thing, or is it not that?
Well, it's a little more complicated. We know nothing as humans and us too, but it's a little more complicated than that, because we've read some studies. But so they know that most of the Western population has a particular microbe that I don't remember the name of, that we lost with the syphilis outbreaks, because the drugs we were given, or the drugs that were given to folks pretty much wiped out this particular microbe that was in our human system. There are populations of the world, I think one's in the Amazon and some are in Africa, that have this particular microbe still, right? But the DNA of that microbe is different enough. They can't just go to Africa, harvest that, and put it in white people. That microbe is specific to that region, the DNA of the folks that still have it. It does nothing. It can't be transplanted
So this
to
is
us. So that microbe, the Western population of that microbe is gone. It blinked out. We can't bring it back, even though there are humans that have it still.
So are you saying that when people either came from that area or exposed to that area, they evolved in a way that allowed that microbe to stay alive and do something different in Europe as they left? You know, South America, go to Europe, all of a sudden, you know, you've adjusted to it over time. That kind of thing?
So
or?
there's transient microbes that kind of come and go, and our biome changes, like I'm living here, or, you know, I'm in New York for 3 weeks, and there's the transient stuff. But our core population, we are what we are born with. And so if we came from a mother who maybe she was a C-section, so her microbiome wasn't quite as strong to begin with, and then didn't eat so well, and then I was a C-section, that smaller population, that core flush that we get the moment we go from sterile to part of this world, that can't really be grown, that's kind of a ouch for people. I mean, you can do a lot, you can be healthier, and you certainly don't want to not try. But as far as those core microbes, the ones that are down deep in with us, those ones don't change. So I lived all over the world as a child, and I probably have some microbes that I've picked up that are still with me from those places, and my core ones. But as far as just really being able to build it up once you're past childhood, I think my understanding anyway is that it's really a whole different beast.
That would
Without
be,
things like fecal transplants and
Yeah.
things like that.
that would be a really huge argument for really being careful with how many antibiotics you ingest. Because
Yes.
otherwise you can wipe the whole thing out, right? In a way.
And people do.
And people do. Wow. I mean, you've just basically committed genocide. You've killed a whole culture right there. It's just a teeny culture, right?
You have, and then the thing after that is that your body's designed to keep parasitic things out. So that's why our stomach, you start out, once you get through the front door, it's an acid bath, right? It's to try to kill as much as they can that's not beneficial to our body. That was the first defense. And so pathogens, if your body's really healthy, and the way it's been explained to us by doctors is that, especially small intestine and large intestine, if everybody's kind of grooving and they've figured it out and it's healthy, pathogens still come through, but there's no place to set. There's no place to colonize. Every seat's taken in the hallway by people that are happy to be there, and so you just keep walking, no seat, or like a parking spot, right? You go through the parking lot, no spots, so you leave. And that's what those pathogens do. But think about it, huge giant parking lot, and you just had a couple courses or a course of antibiotics. There's lots of parking spots. And so you can stop there and no one's parked, and so then I can take the next spot and the next spot. So as a pathogen comes in, there's lots of places to colonize. So I think that's why, even doctors now will say once after antibiotics, start on yogurt, start on these kind of things. What they're wanting you to do is to eat enough of the
Fill those parking spots.
Fill those parking spots, exactly. They're trying to get you to fill those parking spots as fast as possible, because the pathogens, if they can park too, they will, and then they take residency. So that's why it's still hopeful, because even if you've done a round of antibiotics, just focusing on things that are live foods with good probiotics in them, you're filling up those parking spots basically to.
Right, and that's I think where what I was saying might have come across more harsh. So anything that you've had, like if you had a wonderful immune system, and or even, you know, whatever you were born with, even if you napalm it with antibiotics, all those species can come back. It's just you can't get a new species that you didn't have, is more what I was trying to say, if that makes sense.
So when it jumps in the acid bath, so to speak, your examples are great. I mean, it makes it very. I mean, let's face it. This is in my reading. It is microbiology. It's biology. There's chemistry. There's all kinds of different topics that you sort of are processing here in one thing, and you're doing food.
And it's tasty.
Nutrition, and it's tasty. But I mean, this is a lot of different fields that go into this, and it all comes down to something that makes my body healthier. But there's a couple things concepts that we have that we say, oh, no, that's not a healthy thing. So acid in your gut is one of them, right? Oh no, too much acid is bad. And yet you put acid in your gut all the time in the foods you ingest, correct? You're talking about ciders and vinegars.
So acidic foods.
Yes.
You want to take the...
Well, there's a couple things there. So what's really interesting is part of the healthcare, people feeling is that our guts aren't as acidic as they used to be. So a lot of people have to take like hydrochloric acid to help process their food, because if they're not processing it correctly, they're not pulling out the vitamins they need. So in that case, sauerkraut or some of these acidic foods, they actually have digestive enzymes in them. And so they're helping your stomach kind of wake up and get to work, because some soda pop is a huge example, or carbonated things, is actually brings our stomach acid down and makes it really hard for us to process our food. So these foods that have all this acid in them is actually a good acid. It's an acid that helps us get in there and work it out. The other interesting thing is there's the alkalized foods and the acidic foods. An acid food isn't necessarily an acidifying food, and so these foods are high acid, but they alkalize your system.
Now, does this apply to a live pickle and a dead pickle concept? I know I probably misinterpreted all that, but do they both
I know
acidify
that
in
the
same
live pickle is going to have those enzymes, and it is going to help you. I don't know enough about
A pasteurized pickle.
and I'm thinking from the vinegar standpoint of being, so can we go into vinegar for just a second?
You go wherever you need to
Everything
go.
goes to vinegar.
So guess what industrialization figured out with vinegar, right? All the yeast need is some kind of sugar. And so some industrialized vinegars are even wood pulp, cellulose, just something for that yeast to eat quickly. So if your dead pickle is made out of really poor quality ethanol, which has been made from
Wood pulp.
or grains or things that are, easily grown, that's going to be very different than that vinegar that's been made from wine grapes or made from apple cider. And that's why, apple cider vinegar that's raw has a whole different thing going on with health benefits. So that apple cider raw vinegar, if that pickle is in there, even if the vinegar's been, killed off, you've got a whole different host of things going down with that vinegar pickle than you do if it's been made in the wood pulp white vinegar. So that wood pulp white vinegar is amazing to clean with. Like, it's great. Use it.
Just don't put it in your body.
It's just not the best for you. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's bad. I don't know where it lands on that alkalizing thing. I don't know the answer to that. That's a good question, but it's a variation of quality, just like your breads. You've got this and this, your cheese. You've got Velveeta cheese food, and you've got, a farm raw Swiss.
Might have some components, but it's not going to be the full boat. So you're eating for less. You're eating less, same bulk, less benefit, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, sweetie. This is Lyra, our
Hi,
granddaughter.
Lyra. I'm a Lara.
Ooh, that's close.
That's close, huh?
Whoops.
Yeah.
Lyra has got a very good microbiome. She's grown up here. She has been around for all the experiments. She is my best taster.
Ooh, really?
Mm-hmm.
You know, that is not a... I don't know if kids are all that way or not, but I don't think so, because Vinegar and I were not necessarily... I don't know if I want to taste that. If you put it on a cucumber with a little pepper, and yeah, that has been okay, but
Yeah.
they're not naturally oriented toward acidic foods in general, right?
Or bitter foods.
Or bitter foods, yeah.
I think those are two ways we have to have some appreciation early. When we had the market, the thing that would just kill us, I think one of the reasons we wrote the book is, it's so pretty. And so people would be lured in. There's that point of no return where you're under the canopy and you're close enough, you're talking, and then you realize those aren't jellies and jams. I think that's sauerkraut.
Those are fermented beets.
Those are fermented beets. But you've already made eye contact, and the kids would just come up and they just start sampling, they're just grazing. And it's sour and it's sweet and it's pretty and they're just eating it. And then the parents would say, oh, don't do that.
You're not going to like that.
You're not going to like that. That's sauerkraut. As the kids are grazing. And so we started doing educational classes at the libraries and at the Mother's News. There'll be a
Kids kraut.
Kids kraut, which is crazy. But we'll have kids taste raw cabbage, and they've never tasted raw cabbage before. And so they realize, and they'll say, what do you think? And say, well, it's sweet. Does it have sugar on it? So no, that's its sugar. And then these microbes are going to eat that sugar, and they're going to fart. And that's going to make CO2. And they think that is just the coolest damn thing ever. And they have this bag full of these guys who are eating sugar and farting, and you have to burp it because all the farts have to be let out. And they've gotten a chance to
teaches this class.
And they've gotten a chance to touch their food. Like, we're going to make it, you're going to use your hands.
Yeah.
And they look at their parents like, it's okay to touch my food and eat it. And, we'll start out of 50 kids, we'll say, how many people like pickles? And maybe 3 kids raise their hand. How many people like sauerkraut? And there'll be one homeschooled little girl who will bravely put her hand up, even though everyone's going, ew, yuck. And then by the end, it's not that gross thing. It's the story. It's these microbes, and they're doing stuff, and I'm trying to see them, and there's millions of them in there, and it's going to change, and I'm going to get to eat it. And it grosses my parents out, which is so cool, because they're going to go home and go, look at me. I mean, that's what we want as kids, is to start figuring out how we're different.
Well, there's a disconnect between people and their food anyway, often, I think.
Yeah.
I don't know how we evolved that way, because it's such a basic thing to all of us, but that has seemed to be the case. Even, me, I think we had a garden when I was younger, and my dad would, get a steer and half a steer and split it with a neighbor. So it's not like it was unfamiliar, and yet the thought of eating raw vinegar, you stop a second, you go, oh, look, that's got something growing in it. The natural reaction is, if it has something growing in it, I don't know that I should be eating this, should I? You just, for the second, you pause.
Absolutely.
Well, yeah, and that was, that's, look at antimicrobial soaps and, the morning shows telling you, you really shouldn't use a sponge, and, just like over and over again, and put things in the refrigerator as soon as you eat them. And you're done eating them, and, we've been programmed to keep our food safe, and a lot of that's for good reason, but a lot of that isn't fully understanding. Like it's interesting, for example, milk, right? If you have raw milk and it's, clean, been taken care of properly and all of that, those microbes in there, if it goes sour in your refrigerator, turn it to yogurt. If you have pasteurized milk and it goes sour in your refrigerator, it's picked up all kinds of other microbes, and it's not going to ever turn to yogurt, and it's going to be sour and bad for you and make you sick. Yet that raw milk that turned to yogurt isn't.
Now that is a really interesting concept.
Yeah, and I think that's important to talk about, because people take it to the extreme to say, okay, so bread mold must be good, and in all these cases you're basically playing God. Think of it as tiny micro livestock. And so in all these cases, there's all of these guys in the food, and what we're doing is we're designing a a situation, an ecosystem, so that the ones that we want to survive, survive.
And thrive.
And thrive. But we're not killing the other ones necessarily. So for example, in cider, we don't want bacteria, we don't want acetobacter from vinegar to get in there. And so we put airlocks on to keep, because those guys are in the air. So that CO2 creates a protective layer, and as long as it's closed off, the vinegar guys can't get in. So we do things like that. We control in a lot of these ferments, either we want air microbes in or we don't want air microbes in. So in the case of these, we keep everything below this brine line that's created. So that's anaerobic. So all the aerobic, the oxygen breathing microbes can't get to the sauerkraut, right? So we're playing God in the sense we're saying, okay, we want, this team is anaerobic, so we're gonna put them in a brine. We're not gonna let this happen. We want at this temperature. Everybody has their threshold of temperatures that they like. So we maybe put it in a fermenting cave, maybe we keep it on the counter. And some of these, we actually keep it at 105 degrees because that's the ideal sweet spot for those bacteria.
So temperature actually controls a lot of who's going to be successfy.
This is just
Isn't that crazy?
fascinating because it sounds like you're courting disaster with food poisoning, and yet that's where everybody used to be, right? I mean,
Yeah,
so how do you say, okay, that kind of, one of the things is a breakdown, which is kind of like rot, right? I mean, that's sort of like rot in a way, but it's not. What is the difference between those two things? Because what you're describing is the process of some foods breaking down, which...
Okay, so you gotta think, without rot, everything that's existed would still be here.
Right.
Right, so that is a very basic thing.
But we don't eat it, necessarily.
Right, so the idea that there's microbes waiting to break down something from a higher to a lower, and that's just a process, and it has to happen.
Yeah, thank goodness for that, or we'd be
Thank
overrun by, yes.
Yeah, thank goodness for that. So what we're doing is some of those things break it down into what's ingestible, better ingestible, like Kirsten was saying for us. So, but not all of them. So when things really, for the foods I think that we work with, it's a little higher up on the food chain in terms of the breaking things down. So, there's a lot of airborne molds that they colonize over the thing. Think about bread that's left out for a long time.
Well, bread mold is an aspergillus variety. It's aspergillus. It's a wild aspergillus, but aspergillus is koji, and it's a fungus. It's a mold, and it was tamed thousands of years ago in Asia.
Tamed.
Mm-hmm. Just like, truly, just like we tamed dogs. And
You're domesticating it.
It's a domesticated mold. Aspergillus oryzae, koji, is a domesticated mold, as is this one that makes tempeh, which is Rhizopus oligosporus, or oryzae, and also a mold. But the most domesticated mold is koji, and they have different strains of it to do different things. And what you're doing is you're growing basically this mold on a substrate. Traditionally it's going to be barley or rice, but you can grow it on anything because it's like malting in the Western culture. In the Eastern culture, they used this mold. In South America, in the cultures there, and in Africa, a lot of cultures, they used spit to break down these starches because the yeast and the bacteria can't get at the starch when it's a whole starch. They want those simple sugars. And so growing mold is all about harvesting the enzymes. So it's the first step. And what it is those enzymes get in there and they break apart the bigger molecules. So that starch now becomes simple sugars. The protein now becomes amino acids. The fats become fatty acids. All of these things have more flavor, but they're also more available for the lactobacillus or the yeast to do that next step. So it's kind of crazy.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Now in soil out in my front yard, I'm a big fan of a couple of guys that wrote a book called Teaming with Microbes, and they talked about the bacterial fungal balance between the two, the mushrooms are there basically, fungus is there to break down the carbons, and then the bacterium is there to sort of transport, to take the smaller pieces and work with it. So do any of these foods work in that same way? There's one thing to break down and the other thing to do this other secondary purpose?
For sure.
That's exactly what koji's doing. That's why people are, so koji is the first step to sake. It's the first step to miso. It's how you're going to get the enzymes to break down the starch to be able to either make the alcohol or make the paste. And miso is, I call it sometimes a top shelf ferment, because it is the cooperation of all of those microbes. Like all of these microbes that we use to make flavor and to make foods and to make all that happens in a vat of miso. Like they're all in there.
So do you have to have a different level of experience to do some of these domesticated products
Well,
and
miso
others?
is actually one of the easiest ones, because you can go to the store, you can buy yourself koji that's been made by, you know, a factory that grows it and processes it, and dries it out. And then cook up your beans, and they can be soybeans if you want a traditional miso, or they can be, you know, pinto beans or black beans or beans from your garden. It doesn't matter. Actually doesn't just need to be beans, but we won't go there. And you mix the koji, the beans, and salt, squish it all together, pack it down in a vessel and wait. And then the enzymes that came in with the koji are breaking things down. As things get broken down, that lactobacillus and yeast also continue to break things down. And that's why all that breaking down, all that cutting of those larger molecules is where you're going to get all that flavor.
Now, you mentioned the salt. That's one of the things that I was also going to ask about in terms of health, because we have this thing that says, oh, no, you know, low sodium is better for you. But I'm assuming you have a lot of salt in the foods that you eat, if it's a basic component of preserving. Is that true? And does it translate that way, or is it just a general, no, there's not that much salt kind of thing? How does that work? I don't know if that.
It's a good question, because
there's a lot of answers to that.
So if you don't eat enough salt, you'll die.
And unlike a lot of symptoms, not having enough salt or you don't know. There's so many things going wrong with your body, like they can't actually diagnose it.
But we need salt to survive. So that's the first thing, is there truly is as a human, you can't have a no salt diet. You can't not take.
Because we're 4% salt
in
our blood.
It's a painful way to die. So, and one way that happens is when people drink too much water, they basically kind of desalinate a little bit, right? And so that's the way that. So knowing that you need some amount of salt, I think then we always tell people, because we're not nutritionists, but to say, okay, so you need some amount of salt every day, right, to be healthy. It's really a choice of where you're going to get that. And people will say, well, I don't know if I can eat the sauerkraut. And we'll say, well, what do you eat? And we find out, well, they eat fast food twice a day. They're trying to get down to 1 a day. It used to be 3 times a day, but they're really worried about their salt intake. And it's like, well, you probably should, but I wouldn't worry about the sauerkraut, you know. And yeah, when you talk about how much salt there's a tablespoon of salt in that quart. Well, you're not going to eat a quart of sauerkraut, I hope. You're going to eat a little bit of sauerkraut. So that's a small amount of a tablespoon or 3 tablespoons or whatever you put in there. But it's what are you putting on it, you know, and it's the processed foods that have so much salt in them, you know. Again, it's a balanced thing. So we tell people, well, look at where you get all of your salt. And for heaven's sakes, take out the processed food part first, because anything you're buying that's ready to eat, you know, that comes in a can, look at the salt that's in that, and then.
Well, the other piece is, so back in the day, if you made sauerkraut, you used a way more salt than you do now. One reason is they didn't have it in their diets, and it was a great way to add flavor to their foods, and to actually way back to even stretch the salt, because salt was so rare that they needed it, and you could stretch out that goodness that you needed from the salt. So like the recipes in this book average about 1.5% per weight. So 100 pounds of sauerkraut, that's only 1.5 pounds of salt. That is not, it's not anything compared to a chip, for example. And part of the reason we can do that is because we live in a pretty climate controlled space. You know, the salt isn't what preserves these vegetables. The salt controls the fermentation. So if you are fermenting in a really hot climate and you need to slow the fermentation down, you're going to up that salt level because you need to slow that fermentation down, keep it from working so fast. If you're in that hot climate, you need more salt anyway.
You're sweating. That
So
just
it-
occurred to me. So it's naturally balancing itself.
It's kind of naturally balancing itself. But most people, you know, in a temperate climate, they can get away with this 1.5%. They put it in the fridge any way to keep it, and so it's less of an issue that way. And so that's the other thing to understand is all of these foods aren't preserved by the salt. The salt is kind of helping control the ferment, but it isn't the preservation technique. And so you can really play with how much you need.
Yeah, one of the things that I was going to ask about is corned beef. Okay, I guess I have to find my corned beef question here. Corned beef, I did not know that's sort of a preservation method. You start looking into things like this and you realize salt was commonly used. You had salted meats. Hubby comes from Virginia. They salt ham. That is a preservation methodology that we're just, it's a luxury now, but it used to be a practical necessity to slow down the breakdown of foods. So I think of corned beef, I think of salted ham. Is there anything else that you might say, oh yeah, that food was commonly salted to slow down that bacterial breakdown?
Well, for like meat, it's a little bit different in that you're really also asking that salt to pull out the moisture, because the sooner you pull out the moisture, the less places you have for those microbes to thrive. So you get all that moisture out of the muscle. And so for meat, the salt is also that important function. The interesting thing, like if you're looking at some of those, you know, country hams or that old school hams, and there's cold smoked, there's also lactic acid fermentation going on in there. So there's
The smoking part or the
hanging part. There's lactic acid fermentation, acidifying. That's where you're getting those amazing flavors because it's also being acidified.
that's the curing part. Now we bought a share of a cow and they had to hang it for a couple of weeks. And part of me looks at that and says, oh my gosh, the meat in the fridge when I have it at home, it just goes bad after a couple of weeks. If it's a hunk of hamburger, I would no more eat meat. It had been 2 weeks in the freezer than I could, or fridge than I would, you know, I mean, that's just terrible. So it's
So
actually kind of fermenting
It
in a way.
it's rotting. It's those muscle fibers. What's making that tastier? What's making that less? What's the word I'm looking for? Tender. What's making it taste more tender?
It's breaking it down.
It's breaking it down. It's totally fermentation.
So let me ask you a little bit about the history. It says that fermentation's been around since 7,000 BCE. So this is potentially one of the earliest ways of either keeping, preserving, preparing food that I can think of. Can you any little tidbits in the timeline of history of fermenting that you think are important to mention?
Well, Great Wall of China, Kirsten mentioned, they know that, so you got all these slaves building this wall.
Get rice and fermented cabbage.
Yeah. Because they need salt. That was one of the ways, but salt was expensive. So really they fed them fermented vegetables as a way to take a little bit of salt, right, and then spread it out and keep them just alive enough to build the wall, keep working. You know, when the second book was on hot sauces and condiments, and the Neolithic, they found where they were adding different spices to things in Europe to try to make things more more palatable. South America, where the chilies are, you know, they found traces of different capsicum and things from way back. You know, they can find it still in the pottery and do DNA to figure out
Well,
what they're...
Europe was mustard seed, And Asia, you know, you think of Thai food and you think of wonderfully hot, or Indian food, these hot foods. They didn't have the chili pepper until Columbus made his little mistake and brought it back, the trade routes. I mean, not that that has anything to do with fermentation, but it is fascinating that these foods that we now think of as so spicy, you know, are fairly new onto the scene. But I mean, fermentation probably is even older than that, because it happens naturally. As soon as you're milking an animal and you're not drinking that milk in the first instant, and you're keeping it in a, you know, skin bag, you're gonna have yogurt, you're gonna have cheese, even if they don't have records of that yet, right? As soon as you have fresh juice or whatever, that yeast is gonna start making it into alcohol, you know, quickly. So
you pull honey out of a hive and put it in some vessel, and right away the yeast are starting, you're moving towards mead. So fermentation happens without us, which is good, but it does. It is just a natural process of breaking things down, so it happens without us. So, you know, in terms of when it happened, it likely happened, you know, the microbes were on the planet before humans were. We're evolved after them. So I would say it came before us, in that microbes have been breaking things down before we ever got around to saying, oh, that's kind of tasty. And it's even more tasty now than it was a week ago. Don't know why, but I think I like it better like this.
but that's the cool part, right? That's when it became a thing. That's when they realized we can preserve our foods, or we can make our foods tastier. Like, at some point the humans realized this was a good thing, and then we get to, you know, taming aspergillus. Like, oh wow, this mold actually is super sweet and tasty, and look what it does.
I'm going to just have domesticated mold in my head for the rest of the week. That's going to be my
Domesticated.
thing.
It's just the tiniest livestock you can imagine. That's all it is.
Okay, last thing. There are all kinds of vegetables, fruits, ales, ciders, blah, 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 that are considered fermentation items. Cheese, name it. I would like you, as long as you can, to go back and forth and list the things that are fermented foods, please.
Who's starting?
Go ahead.
Chocolate.
You're going to do chocolate. Cider, wine. Just say wine.
Coffee.
Nice. I'll grab the fermented vegetables.
Oh, you're just going to do one vegetable?
We have 64 in there. We'll be here for another hour.
Natto.
Ooh. Sourdough bread.
An African version of a subtilis ferment, dawa dawa.
Gochujang, which is a Korean paste.
Okay, let's do doenjang then.
Okay. Tempeh from Indonesia.
Tape from Indonesia.
Nice. Sake from Japan.
Good. So any number of soy sauces. Shoyu, tamari, Chinese soy, Indonesian soy.
Yeah. What is the one in Mexico with the chewed corn?
Chicha.
Chicha.
Tepache.
Which you should say what that is.
Pineapple, fermented pineapple beverage. Pulque, which is from the...
Yeah, that thing. Agave?
agave.
Like that. I've never seen
I could see it. I
seen
just
agave
couldn't.
done like that. Should we say kvass? Like a beet kvass?
Kvass or a rye kvass.
Yeah. Should get into kefir.
Kefir. Sourdough bread.
I did that one.
Oh, salt rising bread.
Oh, salt rising bread. Crazy. It's made with bacteria, not yeast. The only indigenous bread in the United States, even. From Appalachia. God, that was a good one.
Hot sauce.
Yeah, okay. We should allow that. How that? Whiskey.
So distilled. Yeah, I guess it started out.
Uh-huh.
Okay, vinegar.
Oh, yeah, vinegar. It's very good.
Beer. Did we do wine?
No, we didn't.
If you liked our podcast, please subscribe. This is how we keep going. And please tell your friends to join us. Please feel free to post any questions or comments that you might have to our social media sites. Our Twitter feed is at Backyard Green Films, spelled BKYRDGREENFILMS. Our Instagram is at Backyard Green Films, BACKYARDGREENFILMS. Our Facebook is Backyard Green Films. Our YouTube URL is youtube.com/backyardgreentv.
We want to thank Christopher and Kirsten for having us out at their place today. If you'd like more information about the Shockies or finding out about their classes, or you just want to find out about fermenting, please visit their website at ferment.works. You have been listening to Agri-Culture with your host, Alara Bowman. Please tune in for more upcoming episodes from our travels. We'd also like to thank our producer, Michelle Council. I'm Rick Bowman, your behind-the-scenes editor. Until next time. This has been a presentation of Backyard Green Films Productions, all rights reserved, copyright 2019.